So, hello everyone. Now we're going into Ecclesiastes chapters 3, 4, and 5 in our ongoing Bible study. And I wanted to just, first of all, discuss a little bit. Chapter 1, I did a little research on the term meaningless or vanity, as we talked about it last week. This is in chapter 1, verse 2. The word in Hebrew, heleb, actually means breath or vapor. And it's different than the word ruach, which means wind or spirit. It means something ephemeral, something fleeting, something that is here today, gone tomorrow. It's used sometimes in some of the prophets to talk about idols, the vanity of worshiping worthless things. And so where the preacher or the teacher or the collector of words, koheleth, as it says in the Hebrew, speaks of the vanity of everything. It's the transitory nature of the world and how pursuing those things is meaningless. So we get to chapter 3, where we get more into some of the more well-known parts of Ecclesiastes. There's the song from the birds, to everything turn, 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 for every season turn, turn, turn. It was a song written in the 60s. If you look it up, Birds is Byrds. You'll find it, and it was quite a popular song. And that's a lot of the idea behind what people think of as Ecclesiastes. Well, it goes a lot more than that. The teacher, this sage, if you will, this wise teacher, is saying there's a time for everything. A time, he concludes, for love, a time for hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. He doesn't define when those are. It's just somehow we're supposed to know, well, it's time. And that's a little, how do you know? You just know. So that's kind of difficult to follow. But we do know that there's times where it's more appropriate than others to mourn or to laugh, to build or to tear down, that sort of thing. But it gets a little deeper when he gets past this time for everything discussion, when he says, what does the worker gain from all his toil, in chapter 3, verse 9. In verse 11, he's made everything beautiful in its time. He has set eternity in the hearts of men. This is a cryptic verse. It's almost as if to say he wishes that there was eternity. We don't know. Later on in this section, he'll say, who knows that the spirit of man goes up and the spirit of animals goes down. Excuse me. That's one of those things that Ecclesiastes is not dogmatic. It's not clear with doctrine. It's more of a wonderings and puzzles, so to speak, of somebody who's lived a long life and is looking back and looking for the meaning of it all. So this phrase, he has set eternity in their hearts, a longing for something permanent, a longing for something eternal. I think to the teacher, to Koheleth, God is eternal, but certainly humans are not, and our life is not. That's why he goes on in verse 12, I know there's nothing better for men than to be happy and to do good while they live. that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toil. This is the gift of God. This may be actually the sum total of what the teacher actually thinks he can find any fulfillment in. You'll see that he looks in riches, he finds nothing. In work, he finds nothing. He sees oppression and the people who are weighed down by burdens as having a meaningless life. And so the only thing he finds that gives any relief from the meaninglessness is finding satisfaction in what you're doing, in the toil. This is a gift of God, as he says in verse 13. And then verse 14, I know everything God does will endure forever. And so this idea, humans are transitory. We're like a vapor. But God is eternal. So anything that is done for God will give us some benefit in feeling that at least in this life, there is some satisfaction in it. So in verse 15, God will call the past to account. So in some sense, even in this life, to the preacher, to Koheleth, God will in some way use what is done in this life to good or bad for those who are in this life. He goes on and says, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. Verse 17, I thought in my heart, God will bring to judgment both the righteous and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, a time for every deed. And there he goes into this idea, verse 18, that this life tests us to show that we're no better than animals. We both die, animals and humans, verse 19. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. There's no advantage. It's all meaningless. This is this recurring theme of meaninglessness through the whole book of Ecclesiastes. Verse 21, who knows if the spirit of man rises upward, the spirit of the animals goes down into the earth? There's a sense of maybe a hope, a possibility of some kind of an afterlife, but he doesn't know. So as he returns to this theme in verse 22, I saw there's nothing better for a man than to enjoy his work, because that is his lot. For who can bring to him to see what will happen after him? So this idea of this life is meant to have some sense of satisfaction just in having life itself. I think there's a value to that. I really do. I think that there is some truth to enjoy life because it is something that God gives. And so if we are righteous, we are blessed to be able to enjoy it. And so we come to chapter 4, where it gets a little bit more into his theme about good and evil and the end of both. I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun, the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Now, this is ironic because if he is the king, can he not do something to end the oppression? And yet, I think there's this tacit understanding that even a king has limits to what the king can do as far as eliminating oppression, which is an interesting commentary on human nature and on the world we live in and on political reality. So it gets even more morbid after that in verse 2. I declared that the dead who are already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who is not yet, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. And so there's this pessimism, this sense of reality is horrible. People suffer, and there's no escaping that. And that is a rather pessimistic outlook, again, that you'll see through Ecclesiastes. But I think it's based on the fact that when you look at the world, you see a lot of that. It's just true. There's a lot of suffering, and humans have the ability to stop a lot of it, and yet we don't. Why? Ecclesiastes does not answer why there's suffering. Ecclesiastes merely points out it happens, and it just seems to be the lot of so many people to have to go through it. Verse 4, all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This is meaningless. So the idea of covetousness, of envy of what somebody else has, Ecclesiastes says, that's because you don't understand. You just don't see that there's nothing to this. I'm reminded of the Buddhist concept of illusion coming from trying to grasp and hold on to that which is transitory. The things of this world to the Buddhist are just illusionary. And so our trying to grasp and hold on to them to fulfill ourselves is destined to failure. There's some sense of that here in Ecclesiastes, not in a positive way, but more in a negative way. Now we have in chapter 4, verse 5, a little bit of Proverbs. The fool folds his hand and ruins himself. Better one handful of tranquility than 2 handfuls of toil and chasing after wind. And he goes on with some other Proverbs, something meaningless under the sun, a man all alone. There is no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. So this idea that wealth is not going to fulfill us, you'll see some of that in Ecclesiastes. Verse 9, I think this is actually one of the more wise sayings in all of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 4, verse 9, it says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their work. And so this idea that it's better not to be alone, it's better to have a companion. If one falls down, his friend can help him up, but pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if 2 lie down, they're able to keep warm. And then verse 12, it says, 2 can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So this idea that 3 is better than 2, so that sharing the load is a wise thing to do. Verse 13, better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to take a warning. And then he concludes chapter 4. There is no end to all the people who were before them. Those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is a meaningless chasing after wind, this recurring theme of chasing after wind. Now in chapter 5, the teacher gets into relationships with God and how the teacher thinks of those relationships. And this is kind of interesting. Chapter 5, verse 1, guard your steps when you go into the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer sacrifice of fools. So to listen is to hear so as to obey. So it's not that Ecclesiastes sees nothing in our relationship with God. In fact, quite the opposite. Even if this life is all there is still the fear of the Lord, which should make us wise, and that's better than being a fool. So we have this idea of sacrifices. In this case, he uses the word for those sacrifices that are not Holocaust or entire burnt offerings, but those sacrifices which are given to God and then eaten by the people who have killed this animal. It's like a feast. And so it's better to be cautious and to listen than it is to feast and say that we're doing this for God. Verse 2, do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are earth. Therefore, let your words be few. This is perhaps something to bear in mind when we pray. I'm reminded of the story in 1 Samuel of Hannah, the barren woman who would go and pray and would be quiet and just mouth the words. And so the priest wondered if she'd been drinking. And she says, no, I'm praying. And with earnestness, it's not how long we spend in prayer. It's where our heart is when we come to God. Are we honest? Are we truthful? And so we don't need to say a lot. We just need to say it from the heart. And he sums it up in verse 3. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. So the more we say, the less we're saying. Choose your words wisely is kind of the thought here, even especially with God. Verse 4, when you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. It's better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. So again, this concept, God is great. And while life may be meaningless, God can make it worse. Don't do that. So this thought that be careful about your relationship with God and with making promises to God that you cannot fulfill. Verse 8, if you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, don't be surprised. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both higher still. The increase of the land is taken by all, and the king himself profits from the fields. Or in the Latin, in the Vulgate version, the king is the servant or served by the fields. Everything ultimately gets back to the earth. Without the fruit of the earth, nobody lives. And so there's some wisdom in understanding even the king with his many subjects still depends on the earth. And the earth is the Lord's, and the earth depends on the Lord. And so we depend on the Lord to take care of the earth, to take care of us. There's this understanding there, which is wisdom. Verse 10, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is vanity, meaningless, vapor. Money, as it says in, I forget if it's 1st or 2nd Timothy, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so, as Jesus says in the gospel, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So this love of money is meaningless. It's foolishness to the teacher. As he goes on, he says in verse 12, the abundance of the rich man permits him no sleep. We don't own things. Things own us, because the more you get, the bigger place you have to store it. The more you worry about taking care of it, the more insurance you need to make sure that it's covered. That's what this is about. The riches themselves do not bring you an end to worry. Now you have other things to worry about, the things you have. So in verse 13, I've seen grievous evil, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owner. Some of those things we own can actually work against us. Or wealth lost through some misfortune. Naked, verse 15, naked a man comes from his mother womb, and as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry it in his hand. And so, verse 18, this again, he comes back to this idea that enjoy life, not in a hedonistic way, not in this eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die concept that the Apostle Paul says is antithesis of Christian faith, but rather feel that God has given us something and we are grateful and we enjoy it. Verse 18, I realized it is good and proper for a man to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toilsome labor under the sun, given the few days of life God has given him, for this is his lot. Moreover, when God gives any man wealth and possessions and enables him to enjoy them, to accept his lot and be happy in his work, this is a gift from God. He seldom reflects on the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with gladness of heart. And so this, I think, is an ongoing theme that we will see coming back. Life is meaningless. However, we do have things that we find in life that can give us some joy. We can find meaning in the work and enjoy what we're given. That is a gift of God. And so, yes, there is suffering. Yes, there is oppression. Yes, there is wickedness. And yes, there is injustice. But somehow God allows us to enjoy those things that we have in spite of what we see in the world. It is all a vapor, but yet there is life itself. And this is a gift from God. So thank you for joining me. We will cover chapters 6, 7, and 8 in our next session next week. Blessings to you.